This is part 2 of 3 of my discussion with Todd Thurman. Todd hails from Texas and has a 25-year career in the swine industry. This part of our discussion continues on the timely topics of the pork industry and consolidation, coupled with what we think might happen in the next decade. Oh yes, and I think what term that I hear from the non-ag side, it probably applies to the swine industry, and it's a challenge. We probably need to right size, and right size needs to take into account what our real demand is, and we also need to take into account the genetic progress that our genetic companies are making that just is mind-boggling.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that I never would have predicted most of the turns that I've made in my career. And one of them that I've taken recently is I certainly didn't see coming, and it was really a result of COVID in a lot of ways. I took an assignment during the COVID break. I mean, I travel 160 to 200 nights a year, and COVID showed up, and all of a sudden that went to zero, and so that frees up a lot of time, and it also creates a scenario where your wife that's not used to you being around all the time starts saying about 3 months in, don't you have somewhere to go? Or,
I love you, but I don't like you.
yeah. So anyway, so I ended up taking some assignments, some projects that I almost certainly wouldn't have otherwise, and one of those was trying to project long-term food demand in China, and I ended up buying the model back from my client after I got finished with the project because I was so interested in what was going on. And I was really digging into these demographic shifts and how that's going to impact demand. And I think that's a huge issue for agriculture in general. But it's in a lot of ways and for a lot of different reasons, pork is kind of a canary in the coal mine. And I think we're going to deal with some of these issues earlier than some of the other commodities. And so I'm encouraging folks in the pork industry to be really, trying to create awareness of that issue moving forward. And then everybody else in agriculture, I'm encouraging them to keep an eye on what's going on in pork, because I think it's going to be a preview of what's to come for these other commodities. And that's a real challenge moving forward is where's that demand going to come from? We could do a whole podcast on that alone, but the reality is that about 20 countries in the world consume over 90% of the pork, and 11 of those 20 countries are already in population decline, right? And so if we start thinking about what does that mean for long-term demand globally, that has to be a concern. And then we look at the other side and we say, okay, well, there's a bunch of countries that are still growing rapidly, right? So there's a lot of potential there, and that's certainly true. But if you look at the 50 fastest growing countries in the world, the ones that are expected to grow the fastest over the next 25 to 50 years, almost all of those are in Africa and parts of the Middle East. And about 50% of the population growth there is going to be Muslim, which is a problem for us, right? From a pork perspective.
We can't get Muhammad to rewrite the Quran.
I'm not expecting that. That's a pretty big ask. And so, as we think about that, what does that mean? I mean, currently that region accounts for, I think, less than 2% of global pork production or pork consumption. And so, is there a lot of opportunity there? For sure. I'm super bullish on opportunity in Africa. I spent quite a bit of time there, but is that going to replace, an expected significant population decline in all the places that traditionally have consumed a lot of pork? I think that's hard math to make that work. So, I go around and I give a lot of these talks, and naturally, people ask, well, what's the solution? And I don't have the solution. I've got some ideas. I certainly don't have any complete solutions. I might not have any answers at all, but I'm really just trying to generate a dialogue within the industry about the issue, and try to kind of stimulate some discussion. But one of the things that I've mentioned is we need to, like you said, we need to figure out how to right size the industry, and there's not a clear way to do that in our structure today. And so I was in Canada a while back and talking about some of these challenges, and somebody said, well, what's the solution? I said, well, the solution is for the 40 biggest pork producers in the U.S. to get together and figure out how we're going to make sure that we have the right number of animals that we need to make this industry profitable. The problem is that's entirely illegal and never going to happen. So
let's all get together in the Ozarks and
so,
hammer this out.
So the solution in China is pretty straightforward, right? The government can just control that, right? Now, deciding what that number is and should be, and the government being the ones that make those decisions has got its own issues. But there's not a mechanism for that, not a clear mechanism for that. And so how we move forward is not entirely clear. We need some new strategies, and there's not a lot of willingness in our industry to kind of grapple with some of those issues, to even kind of recognize some of those issues, and begin to, think about what some of those solutions look like.
Well, I think you and I have talked about some of the demand challenges that we have. I know that you and I share an opinion that some of our pork is carrier for condiment anymore. It's not much different than chicken breast. So if we take the Genesis model and try and make things more flavorful, a little more marbling, change the color of it, we might affect demand a little bit, but we're not going to take consumption from 50 to 75 or 100 pounds. I think we've become accepting of our economic signals of low profitability, and we're no longer looking for those home runs and changing profitability. We're happy at that flirting around zero. If you look at the profitability chart, that I don't care if it comes from Joe Kearns or it comes from Iowa State or Missouri, it's going right here around zero. And you look at some of our competitors, it's up here. I think it goes back to maybe supply side issues that might take some type of collusional type of thought process to actually get it. And if you think back to what happened when we got rid of 300,000 sows in Missouri, southern Iowa, it did nothing other than make a lot of buzz and people talk. Might have made that company a lot of money because they got rid of some sows they didn't need anyways.
Well, it goes back to something I alluded to earlier is if you just, especially if you're an economist and you don't really have any experience in agriculture and you're just looking at this from the outside, your assumption is that this is just going to become entirely integrated, just like the poultry industry, right? And you're just going to fold the meat processing industry in with live production, and live production is going to basically become a cost center for the meat processing. And maybe that's where it ends up, right? It's certainly an option, and that's certainly possible. But what I've been telling people is if that's what happens, it's not going to be because that's what the Packers wanted, right? You go to the Packers and they're very clear. They want to control a portion of their supply because it helps, with their procurement costs. And, there's quite a few reasons why they want to do that. But that's not 100%. Most of them will tell you somewhere between 40 and 60% that they would like to be able to have direct control over. And then, and so if they end up having to bring that into the fold and become completely integrated because that's the only path forward, it's not going to be because that's what they wanted. And the reality is the production risk in pork production is significantly different than it is in poultry. Mm-hmm. I talked about when we had the supply chain disruptions during COVID, we got hit the hardest, right? The pork industry got hit the hardest because the ruminants always have an option of putting animals back out on pasture, right?
Oh yeah. Just feed them more fiber; they'll be all right.
Yeah, we can hold them out there for a long time, right? Put them on wheat pasture or whatever. There's a lot of different things we can do there. And then on the chicken side, the cycle is short enough that it's just not really that disruptive if you just shut everything down for a little while.
What's the deal to pull the plug on some incubators?
Yep. Yeah. You crack some eggs and I'm certainly not a poultry expert, but what is the, to take a broiler to market's 40 days, 45 days or something like that.
Yeah. So you're 2 months from set to harvest.
Right. And so, there's, if you have disruptions, if you have issues, you're making adjustments there. It's not that hard because that cycle's a lot shorter and you can start and stop. You try to play that game in the pork industry, and I've seen it, people try it. And when you do, you magically hit all the lows and miss all the highs, it's just kind of the way it goes. And so the reality is the because of the value of the animals and because of that length of that biological process that, so far we haven't figured out a way to resolve some of those issues. As long as those things are true, it's just going to be a lot different risk profile. And so I think there's an argument to be made that it's unlikely that we end up with that solution, that completely integrated, you only got 2 or 3 major, players in those industries. I think it's probably unlikely that happens. And so then you start thinking about, maybe we go back to a less consolidated model. Maybe these land-based guys, I look at folks like, that are big enough to take advantage of the scale. But you think about folks like Rob Renneman and Jimmy Tosh that, are big players, right? Yeah. But they also still have that connection to the land piece that really makes their business, more resilient in a lot of ways. And so, maybe something like that, taking a step back, maybe 3 Smithfields is not the future. Maybe it's something like 40 Toshes, or something like that.
Could the Murphy family buying back part of the Smithfield production just be the start of some of that? I won't call it deconsolidation because it's still an integrated model, but could that be a start of something?
I think it's definitely a sign. I do a lot of work in strategic foresight, and we look at what we call signals. These kind of indications that something's shifting. I think that's an example. We saw the IPO recently announcement for Smithfield as well. And so I think, the industry is beginning to, try to think through some of those. Okay, where is this going? What's this, what's this look like? If we stretch this thing out to 10 years, to me, it's almost impossible to imagine that we just keep going with the status quo for 10 years, how long can we keep hammering at this? I mean, I don't know. It's probably longer than I think, and maybe it's 10 years. I don't know, but it's not 20 years, so something's got to change. Something's got to give. And so I think the industry is beginning to grapple with some of those issues. And
if we go with status quo with sow numbers, in 10 years, we're going to have 150 million pigs. We can't do that. So somebody's going to have to blink and really get rid of some sows.
Yeah, and I think we've seen with some of these situations that come up, it's, how do you do that? Right? In the past, we've done that by getting rid of a bunch of small players that, really most of them were diversified in some way, shape, or form, and they just liquidated their swine assets and reinvested in, their crop farming operation or their cattle or whatever it was. I'm not suggesting that was not a painful process for some of those folks, but a far different situation. We just don't have any of those, enough of those folks now to make any difference. And so now you're talking about, if you're going to get rid of some sows in chunks, you're talking about situations. There was one in Northwest Iowa, not too long ago. And you think, okay, is this just going to go away? It almost can't. That would be devastating to that community. That is a rural community in Northwest Iowa where, I would imagine they were among the biggest employers, And so, the reality is those sows don't go away. Some of the farms that are old or ill-positioned or whatever, they go away, but the other ones get soaked up by other, integrators in the area. And so, it's just really hard, and that's what concerns me is I'm having trouble imagining how we get there without having a really painful, almost crisis. And if we can avoid that, I'd love to avoid that, and that right now that's my big concern is that I'm having trouble imagining a scenario that doesn't involve a really painful process for us to kind of get right-sized.
Well, we could have 2 trains that are running non-parallel courses that could hit. And the one that you and I don't directly work with because we're not on that side, but what if we do solve one of our disease problems? And we magically go from 30% to 28% mortality. Or, God forbid, we go to 20% mortality wean to finish. Then we're really going to have to get rid of some sows then. Because, like it or not, we have adapted to having sick animals.
Yeah, and so, and that's one of the the things I pointed out to some of the genetic folks is, let's assume we're successful here. You know, I don't think anybody is, you know, rooting for more dead pigs, right?
No.
But the reality is it has, you know, consequences that we're not really well equipped to deal with. You know, and one of the arguments, the pushback I got from some of them was, oh, it's going to take some time. You know, it's going to be, you know, it's not going to happen overnight. And I'm like, man, it's not going to happen overnight, but it might happen pretty fast enough that, you know, natural attrition is not going to be enough.
Oh yeah. All of a sudden you're going to have 1,500 pigs to put in that 1,200 space. It's like, oh crap. I hope we solve some of those disease challenges because we have a sustainability issue from that standpoint. But if we do solve them, we've got bigger problems industry-wide dealing with that number of pigs.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, there's several different scenarios that come into play there. And, you know, I'm also concerned about our ability to stay competitive globally. I mean, if you believe some of the numbers that are coming out of Brazil, we're not the low-cost producer anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And that has consequences as well. So, you know, as we move forward, we got to think about that side too. So, I know this is kind of becoming, it's sounding a little dark or whatever, but I think there's plenty of, you know, this is a very innovative industry with a lot of really sharp people in it. I am 100% confident that we can solve these issues. My concern is that we're not engaging with them, and at the level that we need to be engaging with them. And so that's why I've spent a lot of my time recently trying to create kind of awareness of some of these issues. And I'm a natural optimist. All of us are. Like, if you're in this industry still, like, you're probably an irrational optimist at this point. And so I'm certainly optimistic, fundamentally optimistic, but, there's a lot of issues a lot of big questions that need answers. And I just don't see enough energy being directed in that direction. There's a lot of threats. There's a lot of, you know, unfavorable trends that we need to be talking a lot more about. And I don't want to get negative. And I try to, you know, finish up all of my presentations with a note of optimism. And that's genuine, because I do feel like we're going to get these things resolved, but I would like to do that in a way that is less painful if possible.
From the outside looking in and in the presentation, there's a lot of things that our industry could talk about. Our feed efficiency is so much better than it used to be. Sow productivity is just off the charts. When I had my own sows and was working in farms in the late 80s, you talked about weaning 12 pigs. You're like, oh, that one sow might do it, but not the whole herd. And now we're talking about 35 pigs per sow per year. It's crazy from that standpoint. You look at our carbon footprint, the energy involved in raising a pig, and then think about harvesting a 320 pound pig when I was selling that same age pig at 240. So there's a lot of successes, a lot of sustainability stories that are great that our industry has. It's just, I think you and I are on the same page that there's some road signs saying that only goes so far. We got some big things on the horizon we need to address.
Well, in a lot of ways, we're victims of our own success. You know, like you said, you know, like a lot of those things that kind of took care of themselves before don't now. I mean, when you can dump a bunch of sows and still end up with, you know, we had record losses in 2023, at least according to the official numbers. We had record losses in 2023, and we produced more pork in 2023 than we did in 2022. You know, I mean, it's just mind-boggling. You went almost an entire year losing substantial amounts of money, and you still produced more pork than you did the previous year. And that all made sense when this underlying current of demand was still moving so rapidly, both domestic and globally. And that's one of the big things that I uncovered when I was doing some of my initial demographic and population work is, you know, we have some important markets that are already in decline in Europe and East Asia. But the other part of that story is in everywhere else, even in Africa, the rate of population growth is slowing. And so, you know, all of these systems that we built our industry on were built on an assumption, right? That really two assumptions, actually three. So they were built on the assumption that there's going to be more mouths to feed, substantially more mouths to feed tomorrow than there is today, because population growth is growing at a huge clip. Those people are going to have more economic resources because global GDP has been expanding, at a significant clip. And then you throw globalization in there where you sort of, if you're an exporter, you expand that potential pool of demand substantially. And so that's really what you and I and pretty much everybody else that's still working in the industry today consider to be normal. And from a historical perspective, it's just really abnormal. It's a really, it's kind of a sweet spot, that is not going to continue. Right. And so that population growth rate globally, peaked at around a little over 2%, so every year you got 2% more people, that need to eat. Right. I mean, it just drove that whole, produce more, quantity, mentality that we all grew up around. Today it's about 0.87%, and it's going to continue to go down. And it's going to be about 0.25%, in the not too distant future. And so, that environment that we don't even realize, like we just take for granted, it's just not there anymore. And so, it's we're getting better and better at producing it. And the primary drivers of demand are getting weaker and weaker.
Well, I think there's some things that stick in our lexicon. One of them that you and I can do another podcast on is pork the other white meat. And you haven't talked about that for a decade, but everybody still knows it. So that's stuck in our lexicon. It's stuck in our brains. The other one is 10 billion by 2050. When I was in school, it was 9 billion by 2040, I think. But that stuck with us. While we don't hear it from, I hate to use the word, but from the thought leaders and from our checkoff organizations like we did so much a decade or 15, 20 years ago, it's still stuck with us. Oh, we got some more mouths to feed. And if you listen to people talk in presentations, it still comes up every once in a while. And I like the way that you're raising that big old yellow BS flag going, hey, it's not true. But that leads us into what we talked about before. How do we right size our industry? And then how do we right size agriculture as a whole? You and I have talked in the past and on some of our meetings. The bulldozers are still working in Brazil, right?
Yep.
So there's got to be some market signals and some tough decisions for our industry for us to maintain our influence and profitability, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's an unprecedented situation. I mean, you look back through human history, and we've spent the vast majority of human history narrowly avoiding starvation in the good years and not avoiding it in the bad years, right? I mean, that was just, there was an assumption that there's never going to be too much food. Like even that concept is hard for people to wrap their minds around. Can you have too much food? Is that like being too rich or being too beautiful or, whatever? And I'm like, no, you can have too much food and it doesn't have great, it comes with some, negative consequences. Mm-hmm. But it's just, this is a problem that nobody at scale has ever dealt with. It's completely unprecedented, right? Like, and it sounds like a great problem to have. And I mean, it's certainly better than the other problem. But it does create some real unique challenges that our systems aren't designed to deal with. No. And it's a real mindset shift. And that's really hard. I mean, I talk to my clients in China and I tell them, things change so fast here. The industry changes fast. The regulations change fast. The markets change fast, and people just don't change that fast. They just, and that's the real fundamental challenge, is trying to negotiate all of these fast moving changes with the realization that people just have a hard time making those types of mindset shifts, in the kind of time frames that we need to make them. It's just not natural. It's not normal. It's not what we're wired to do naturally. And so we're working against our own nature in a lot of ways, and that's obviously problematic.
Well, and then you add into it the consolidation in our industry that would make industry-wide change illegal, it'd be real easy for us to get 5 or 6 people in a room in a hotel somewhere, and we could make some change pretty quick. But obviously, DOJ and FBI would have a problem with that. So how do we capitalize as the industry on that shift and help capture that change in thought process? I mean, does it take a change in leadership in our industry? Change in market signals?
It could, I mean, let's use the meat quality as an example. I get a lot of people that, when I talk about meat quality and putting the fat back in, getting some flavor back into pork and stuff like that, people will often reach out to me and say, like, why is this not really like going anywhere? And I tell them, until those incentives shift, it's not going to change, because you can go out and make this pitch to pork producers all day, every day, and twice on Tuesday. And if they're not, going to be incentivized to do that economically, then they're not going to be able to change. You'll see some changes around the edges and the periphery, but the industry, fundamentally is not going to change. When I bring visitors from China over, I always take them to the grocery store and show them the meat counter. And a lot of times we're in the Midwest, so I'll take them to a Hy-Vee, right? And okay, usually the pork and usually the pork and the beef are, right side by side in the meat counter. And I say, just look at this. Look at what we have in beef. There's a lot of marbling, right? And then look at the pork. It looks, there's no marbling. There's basically none. And what's driving that? Well, it's the incentive structure. Beef producers are incentivized through their grading system to produce, highly marbled beef. And our producers are incentivized really to do the opposite. And so until those, incentives change, we're not going to make any progress there. So I think a lot of this comes back to two really big picture items. And when I tell people I definitely don't have all the answers, I may not have any of the answers. The two things that I'm pretty confident about is that we have to find a way to get our incentive structures aligned with demand.
Yep.
And then we have to think about how do we make that shift from a quantity focus to a quality focus. If we're able to do that, then we can address, some of these challenges on margin, some of these bigger picture demand problems. That's easy to say and hard to do. And I think that's true for all commodities, actually, in agriculture. I would encourage anybody in any commodity to be thinking, what does that mean for you? What does high quality corn look like? What does high quality turkey look like? What does that mean? Because it's probably going to mean something slightly different to each, commodity. But at the end of the day, I think that's what we're going to have to figure out. How do we define quality, and then how do we adjust our incentive structures to be able to remain profitable, even though quantity is not growing, at least at the rate that it was before?
You bring up some good points that it has to come back to market signals. And I think you and I could go round and round with the disparity between signals. And the one I'll leave you with before we go on to close up with our 5 questions is last year at the Animal Science meetings in Madison, Wisconsin. It's the mecca for swine. It's where everybody comes to present swine data. I attended a session where an international genetic company was going through nutrient requirement. Their criteria for gain, efficiency, profitability, and percent lean. That was what they presented. After that session, I went across the hallway to a symposium led by National Pork Producers Council, talking about the need to improve loin quality. We were 50 feet apart, but you were miles apart when it came to objectives. And when I asked in that previous session about, hey, did you look at anything with carcass quality, meat consumption? No, we don't get paid for it, and that would take too much work to do to have a quality panel. I'm like, well, there you go. And we're back to the mighty dollar bill.
Well, you're talking about a macro issue that I see at a micro level almost every day in my business, and that's, a lack of alignment between these different functional groups in my clients' businesses. I mean, I joke all the time that the most of the work that we do with clients is trying to get everybody first not rowing in opposite directions, but eventually getting everybody rowing in the same direction, and those, some of those advantages that we talked about in terms of specialization have come with unintended consequences, and that is that within companies, our alignment between functional groups is not great. And I spend a lot of time basically patching up these inconsistencies, and so we come in, and I can think of an example where I had a client called and said, look, I'm just really frustrated. This is a nutritionist that calls me and says, look, we're just not getting the results that I'm projecting on our grow finish farms. And he said, I'm just at my wit's end. I don't know what to do, and so I went in and met with him, and I said, okay, so what are you doing from a strategy standpoint? Well, here's what we're doing. So he gives me all the diets. And so I go to the feed mill, and it turns out about 20% of the diets that the feed mill's making is not what the nutritionists thought, right? They didn't update the diets, whatever, different explanations or excuses or whatever it is. And then I go to the farm and I take the feeding program that the nutritionist provided to me. I go to the farm and I ask them, okay, how are you feeding, the animals? And here's what they tell me, right? And so this was actually, we were looking at the sow farms and the wean to finish farms. And the feed budget that first of all, about half of the producers didn't know what a feed budget was, basically.
Yeah, that thing hanging on the board. Yeah.
Yeah. And another few, had their own ideas,
Yeah.
and then a few were at least trying to follow it. And so I went back to the client and said, look, well, the reason you're not getting the results you were expecting is because the feed mill's not making the diets that you thought they were making, and the folks on the farm are not feeding them like you thought. So, that's such a simple thing.
Yeah.
You didn't have to be a genius to figure that out. But it's those disconnects. And so I think we see that at the company level, but I think we also see it at the industry level. And the lack of collaboration between genetic companies and nutrition companies is remarkable to me. I mean, it's crazy. And I understand some of the reasons behind it. There are legitimate reasons for that. But those are the kind of things we have to resolve. And, I hope that my company can play some role in that and facilitating that. But I really think that that's one of those macro issues that the industry has to come to terms with. We need to get aligned, with all these functional groups, the geneticists and the nutritionists and the veterinarians and the production people and the business people and the meat people. We've got to get aligned. And we do, in some ways we do a pretty decent job of that, but in most ways we have huge, massive opportunities there. And those represent the potential for real step changes, right? Mm-hmm. So these are not minor issues. If you could somehow magically get all the nutritionists and all the geneticists on exactly the same page, I mean, that's transformational for the industry.
That illustration you brought up is probably fodder for breaking up some of the integration, because there's not that economic incentive between the nutritionist and feed mill and the grow finish. What would happen if that grow finish guy actually had to pay the feed mill for that feed? There'd be some impact. Then the feed mill had to actually make what was ordered, as opposed to just kind of following what the nutritionist said. That could be an illustration for breaking up Ma Bell. But at the same time, it's an illustration that those are probably some simple changes within that one organization that can be replicated across the industry. And they're tools that I've used a lot.
Yeah. And so, one of the things one of a common misconception is that in these integrated companies, they make decisions based on, the collective value, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and that should be, at least on paper, that should be one of the huge advantages of having an integrated business,
Should be.
in the first place. The reality is that rarely happens, right? When I worked at Cargill, we had the feed, piece, we had the live production piece, we had the meat processing piece. When you're at Cargill, you've got your fingers in almost everything.
Yeah.
And that business was run in a very siloed way, right? Mm-hmm. That didn't even account for the basic idea that a lot of times the meat business is going to have a good year at the live production division's expense, and maybe vice versa, right? Mm-hmm. But that didn't happen. And it rarely does. I'm not picking on Cargill here. It rarely does. It always is sort of siloed. And if you're treating those as two completely separate P&Ls, then you're not taking advantage of that potential of integration. There are examples of very integrated industries. Russia is actually a good example.
Okay.
Where they're integrated from retail all the way back to crop production. In a lot of those businesses. And they do look at it that way. They keep separate P&Ls for each of these functional groups because they all have targets and goals and all that kind of stuff. But they tend to look at the big picture every year. So we always have these discussions in the context of the bigger picture, right? But in most of the world, in my experience, that rarely happens. And so essentially you've got, in a lot of ways, you have some of you capture the disadvantages of a large integrated business, and you don't capture all of the advantages.
So is that Russian mentality because of 75 years of communism, or is that just built in the Russian DNA?
My belief is that it is an extension. It's a good result of a bad thing.
Okay.
Right. It's a lack of trust. They don't trust each other, and so they feel like they have to control every phase because they don't trust each other enough to be able to have a collaborative relationship at scale.
And that was Russian communism, right?
Yeah. I mean, okay. and so, I mean, there's, so it's a cultural thing. And again, I think it's largely, it's a bad thing, right?
Yeah,
like
I got you.
Having a culture that has a lack of trust is one of its key features. Is just not a fundamentally good thing, but it does have some really advantageous, benefits. I don't think they overall outweigh the negatives, but, for example, I think you can make a really good argument that Russia figured out ASF, and basically are managing it, or at least were before, or managing it as good as anybody has ever, right? And that was due in part because they have control of, they have a authoritarian bent to the government, right? Mm-hmm. That's doing that oversight. But even so, within those companies, you have, almost complete control over the entire supply chain. So they don't have to have compliance, from other players. They just decide this is what we're going to do, and that's how we're going to enforce it. And that's what's going to happen. So
internally it's a, you will, not we should.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's completely different than my career. My career has always been, I spent most of my, career, I don't know, a lot of people may not know this, but Cargill Pork, we had contract sow farms also, right? Okay. And so the majority of our, sow production was contract production. I don't recommend that. It's really difficult to execute, but, and so my career has been the opposite of that. So going to Russia and experiencing, that side of it was a real eye opener for me because, you could argue that, you hear about people talking about being a consultant. Being a consultant came natural to me because I spent the majority of my career not having direct, supervision over the people that I was trying to get results out of. Right. And that's essentially what you are when you're an independent contractor. Right. Yeah. You gotta do it. You can't just tell them what to do and fire them if they don't do it. You got to do it the old fashioned way. You got to convince them. And so, but yeah, in Russia, they don't have to do that. Right. It's just, it's a command and control, process. And so, yeah, that comes with advantages and disadvantages, but that is the only place I can think of that really takes advantage of that integration completely, because they do, manage it as one cohesive business.
So I think that would be an interesting conversation for you and I to have with some of the key economists in our industry. Is our capitalism the downfall of vertical integration?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, like we talked about, just the nature of the poultry industry, it just made sense, right? Mm-hmm. You didn't, that'll never happen. And, the other extreme is beef cattle. That'll never happen there. The land requirement and, all that kind of stuff. I mean, that industry is, comically segregated. In a lot of ways. Yes. I grew up around that. It still never ceases to amaze me. I remember, my wife worked at a feedlot, and I'm like, the buyer is the devil. Like, they hated that guy. Oh, yes. And I'm like, what did he do? Like, is the buyer coming to the Christmas party? What are you talking about? We don't even like to allow him onto the yard.
Yeah. You screwed me last Thursday, so I'm not going to put you on the show this Tuesday. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, anyway, so yeah, that's the other extreme, and like we always tend to be, we're kind of somewhere in the middle there. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's a comfortable middle, but a lot of times it's kind of an awkward middle. So, it'd be really interesting to see.
Yeah, it would be. So we have, you and I collectively in our 25-so-year career outside of school have lived in some interesting times. That's for darn sure, in the pig industry. So it's the experiences we've had are not ones that we expected. I know it wasn't what I expected when I went to West Lafayette in 1989. So,
yeah, I had no idea what I was getting into.
Oh yeah. Heck, I did. I was going to Purdue and have fun and chase girls, and I did part of it. So I think we have a great conversation. We'll have to continue this. I see that we could have a multiple guests, just pick one topic and we could pick it apart and have a good time. Thank you for joining us for the second episode of my conversation with Todd Thurman. Join us in the third episode where Todd answers our 5 standard questions. As with the previous discussion, the answers are deeper than I expected and take us into places I didn't expect.